Admiral Sarah Mitchell adjusted the worn baseball cap lower over her eyes as she stepped into the bustling airport terminal. The faded jeans, oversized hoodie, and scuffed sneakers were a far cry from her usual crisp naval uniform adorned with ribbons and stars. At 52, she had deliberately chosen this casual disguise for her cross-country flight. After 30 years of distinguished service in the Navy, including her groundbreaking role as one of the first female Navy SEALs and her recent promotion to Admiral, Sarah craved anonymity during her rare personal time off. The mission that had defined her career was finally complete. For the past 18 months, she had been leading a classified counter-terrorism operation in the Middle East, coordinating with international allies to dismantle a dangerous network threatening global security. The operation's success had earned her the Distinguished Service Medal, but the mental and physical toll had been enormous. Her commanding officer had personally ordered her to take a month of leave, recognizing that even the most elite warriors needed time to decompress. Sarah's destination was her childhood home in rural Montana, where her aging parents still lived on the same ranch where she had learned to ride horses before she could properly walk. Her mother had been battling cancer, and her father was struggling to maintain the property alone. Sarah had arranged this surprise visit, telling no one except her trusted aide about her travel plans. The secrecy wasn't just about operational security, it was about being Sarah the daughter, not Admiral Mitchell the decorated war hero. The airport was typically chaotic for a Friday afternoon. Families with crying children dragged oversized suitcases through crowded corridors while business travelers rushed past, phones pressed to their ears. Sarah moved through the crowds with the practiced ease of someone trained in urban environments, her eyes automatically scanning for potential threats while maintaining the relaxed posture of a casual traveler. Her years of SEAL training had made situational awareness as natural as breathing. At the security checkpoint, she joined the lengthy queue behind a college student with a backpack covered in patches and an elderly couple arguing quietly about their boarding passes. Sarah pulled out her civilian driver's license and boarding pass, documents that identified her simply as Sarah J. Mitchell, marketing consultant from Virginia. The cover story wasn't entirely false. She had earned an MBA before joining the military and occasionally provided strategic consulting to defense contractors during her leave time. The Transportation Security Administration officer was a young man who looked barely old enough to vote, his uniform crisp and his demeanor overly serious for someone checking identification documents. He examined Sarah's license with the intensity of someone new to the job, comparing the photo to her face multiple times before waving her through to the X-ray machines. Sarah placed her laptop, shoes, and carry-on bag in the plastic bins with practiced efficiency. She had traveled extensively for military operations, though usually on military aircraft with very different security protocols. The civilian airport experience always struck her as simultaneously thorough and superficial, extensive procedures that could be easily circumvented by someone with her training, yet sufficient to deter casual threats. The metal detector beeped as she walked through, causing the TSA officer to gesture for her to step aside. Sarah remained calm, knowing that her belt buckle sometimes triggered the sensitive equipment. She had deliberately left all military identification and medals at home, carrying only civilian items that wouldn't raise questions about her true profession. "Ma'am, please step over here for additional screening," the officer instructed, his tone polite but firm. Sarah complied without complaint, extending her arms as the handheld metal detector was passed over her body. The device detected her watch and the small medical alert bracelet she wore, a precaution related to a medication allergy developed after a combat injury years earlier. "Everything looks fine," the officer concluded after the brief additional screening. "You're all set." Sarah collected her belongings and made her way toward the departure gate, stopping at a coffee shop to purchase a large black coffee and a simple sandwich. The normalcy of the transaction felt strange after months of military rations and mess hall meals. She found a quiet corner near her gate and settled in to wait for her flight, pulling out a paperback novel she had been trying to finish for months. The book was a thriller about international espionage, and Sarah found herself silently critiquing the author's understanding of covert operations. The protagonist's methods were flashy but impractical, and the technology described was either outdated or completely fictional. Real intelligence work was far more mundane and methodical than popular fiction suggested, involving countless hours of analysis, coordination, and patience rather than dramatic chase scenes and explosions. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her aide, Lieutenant Commander James Rodriguez, confirming that her absence from the Pentagon would be covered by routine meetings and administrative tasks that could be handled by her deputy. Rodriguez was one of the few people who knew her true location, and his discretion had been invaluable throughout her career. He had served under her command in 2 different assignments and understood the importance of maintaining operational security even during personal leave. As Sarah read her novel and sipped her coffee, she observed the other passengers gathering near the gate. A businessman typed frantically on his laptop while speaking loudly into his Bluetooth headset about quarterly projections. A young mother struggled to entertain twin toddlers while her husband slept in his chair, apparently exhausted from their journey. An elderly woman knitted what appeared to be a baby blanket, her fingers moving with the practiced rhythm of decades of experience. These were the people she had spent her career protecting, Sarah reflected. Not abstract concepts of freedom and democracy, but real individuals with families and dreams and everyday concerns about work and relationships and paying their bills. The weight of that responsibility had never left her, even during the most dangerous missions when her own survival had been uncertain. The boarding announcement interrupted her thoughts, and Sarah joined the queue with the other passengers in Zone 3. She had deliberately chosen a middle seat in the economy section, knowing that her modest appearance and unremarkable booking would attract no attention from airline staff or fellow passengers. Her military training had taught her that the best disguise was often simple ordinariness, becoming so forgettable that no one would remember seeing her. As she handed her boarding pass to the gate agent, Sarah felt a familiar sense of anticipation that came with any journey, even a personal one. The agent, a cheerful woman in her 30s, smiled and wished her a pleasant flight without really looking at her face. Perfect anonymity, exactly as Sarah had intended. The aircraft was a standard commercial airliner, and Sarah's seat was between a teenager absorbed in his smartphone games and a middle-aged woman reading a celebrity gossip magazine. Neither passenger acknowledged her presence beyond polite nods as she stowed her carry-on bag in the overhead compartment and settled into her seat. During takeoff, Sarah closed her eyes and felt the familiar sensation of acceleration and lift that never lost its appeal, even after hundreds of flights in military aircraft. The physics of flight had always fascinated her, and she had briefly considered becoming a naval aviator before discovering her calling with the SEALs. The special operations community had provided challenges that perfectly matched her combination of intellectual curiosity and physical capabilities. Once the aircraft reached cruising altitude, Sarah returned to her novel while the teenager beside her continued his gaming and the woman across the aisle ordered a vodka tonic from the flight attendant. The normalcy of the experience was both relaxing and slightly unsettling after months of constant vigilance and high-stakes decision-making. Her phone, now in airplane mode, contained dozens of unread messages from Pentagon colleagues, defense contractors, and military personnel seeking guidance on various projects and operations. Sarah had promised herself that she would not check her email or return calls during this leave period, recognizing that her staff needed to function independently and that she needed genuine rest. The flight attendant, a friendly man who appeared to be in his 40s, offered drinks and snacks with practiced efficiency. Sarah accepted a bottle of water and declined the pretzels, maintaining the hydration habits that had been drilled into her during SEAL training. Proper nutrition and hydration were automatic behaviors that had helped her survive in environments ranging from desert heat to Arctic cold. As the flight progressed toward its destination, Sarah allowed herself to think about seeing her parents after nearly 8 months of separation. Her mother's chemotherapy treatments had been successful, according to their weekly phone conversations, but Sarah knew that her parents were struggling with the emotional and financial stress of serious illness. Her father, a proud man who had worked the same ranch for 40 years, had difficulty accepting help from anyone, including his own daughter. The ranch held countless memories for Sarah, learning to rope cattle with her grandfather, helping with the harvest every autumn, and spending long summer evenings on the front porch listening to her father's stories about his own military service during Vietnam. Those formative experiences had shaped her understanding of duty, sacrifice, and the importance of protecting the people and places that define home. Sarah's decision to join the military had initially disappointed her parents, who had hoped she would return to Montana after college and perhaps take over the ranch eventually. But they had come to understand and support her career choice, especially after she began rising through the ranks and taking on increasingly important responsibilities. Her mother kept a scrapbook of newspaper articles about Sarah's promotions and commendations, though most of her actual achievements remained classified and would never appear in any public record. The aircraft began its initial descent toward the connecting airport where Sarah would catch a smaller plane for the final leg of her journey to Montana. She gathered her belongings and prepared for the brief layover, looking forward to stretching her legs and perhaps finding a better cup of coffee than the airline had provided. As passengers began standing and retrieving their luggage from overhead compartments, Sarah remained seated until the aisle cleared, a habit developed during years of military travel. Patience and observation were fundamental skills that served her well in both combat situations and civilian environments. The teenager beside her finally looked up from his gaming device and offered a polite smile as he prepared to leave the aircraft. "Have a good trip," he said, the first words either of them had spoken during the flight. "Thank you, you too," Sarah replied, appreciating the simple human courtesy that was sometimes missing in the intensity of military life. These small interactions with ordinary people reminded her of the world she worked to protect and preserve. Sarah followed the other passengers off the aircraft and into the terminal of the connecting airport, checking the departure boards for information about her next flight. The layover was scheduled for 2 hours, providing adequate time to reach her connecting gate and perhaps grab a proper meal before the final leg of her journey home. She was completely unaware that her carefully planned anonymity was about to be shattered by a series of events that would test every aspect of her training, patience, and commitment to maintaining her cover identity. The quiet journey home was about to become something entirely different, challenging her ability to remain hidden while drawing on all the skills that had made her one of the Navy's most elite warriors. The ordinary Friday afternoon at a busy airport was about to become extraordinary, setting in motion events that would reveal the true character of both the unassuming woman in civilian clothes and the people who would soon cross her path. Sarah Mitchell, Admiral and Navy SEAL, was about to face a different kind of mission, one that would test her ability to maintain discipline and composure when confronted with injustice, incompetence, and the abuse of power by those who had no idea whom they were challenging. The connecting airport was smaller than the major hub Sarah had just left, but it buzzed with its own particular energy of travelers rushing to catch flights to smaller destinations across the mountain states. Sarah checked her watch and confirmed that she had 90 minutes before her connecting flight to Montana. The terminal felt more intimate than the massive international airports she was accustomed to, with local artwork decorating the walls and a coffee shop that advertised authentic mountain roast. As she made her way through the terminal, Sarah noticed the increased security presence typical of Post 9/11 aviation. Additional TSA officers patrolled the corridors, and she observed at least 2 air marshals attempting to blend in with regular passengers. Her trained eye automatically catalogued their positions, weapons, and behavior patterns, habits that were impossible to turn off even during personal leave. The departure board indicated that her connecting flight was on time, departing from Gate S7 in the airport's smaller concourse. Sarah decided to grab a sandwich and coffee before heading to her gate, choosing a small restaurant that offered local specialties including bison burgers and Montana beef. She ordered a simple grilled chicken sandwich and black coffee, maintaining the unremarkable profile she had carefully cultivated. While waiting for her order, Sarah observed her fellow travelers with the passive interest of someone trained in human behavior analysis. A family was dealing with a crying infant while trying to manage multiple carry-on bags and a stroller. A businessman spoke loudly into his phone about a delayed shipment, clearly frustrated with the impact on his schedule. An elderly couple studied a map and discussed their grandchildren's upcoming graduation ceremony. These ordinary scenes of travel stress and family connections reminded Sarah of the life she had largely sacrificed for her military career. At 52, she had never married or had children, dedicating herself entirely to service and the demands of special operations. While she had no regrets about her choices, moments like these sometimes made her wonder about the paths not taken. Her food arrived promptly, and Sarah found a quiet table where she could observe the terminal while eating. The sandwich was surprisingly good, made with locally sourced ingredients that reminded her of home cooking. As she ate, she reviewed her mental checklist for the upcoming visit with her parents, including medical appointments she wanted to attend with her mother and ranch maintenance tasks she could help her father complete. After finishing her meal, Sarah made her way toward Gate S7, passing through another security checkpoint designed to verify that passengers were boarding the correct flights. The process was routine and efficient, with TSA officers checking boarding passes and identification documents before allowing access to the gate areas. The officer checking Sarah's documents was a woman in her 40s with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested a long shift. She examined Sarah's boarding pass and driver's license with professional efficiency, comparing the photo to Sarah's face before nodding approval. Everything was proceeding exactly as Sarah had expected until she approached the final checkpoint before her gate. "Ma'am, please step aside for additional screening," announced a TSA supervisor who had been observing the passenger flow. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who took his authority very seriously. His name tag identified him as Supervisor Morrison, and his expression suggested that he viewed every passenger as a potential security threat. Sarah complied without question, though she was puzzled by the request. She had already passed through multiple security checkpoints without incident, and her documentation was in perfect order. Her carry-on bag contained nothing but civilian clothes, toiletries, and her paperback novel, items that had already been X-rayed and examined. "Is there a specific concern?" Sarah asked politely, maintaining the calm demeanor that had served her well in far more dangerous situations. "Random additional screening," Morrison replied curtly, though his tone suggested that the screening was anything but random. "Please place your bag on the table and step back." Two additional TSA officers appeared, a young man who looked nervous and an older woman who seemed more experienced. They began examining Sarah's carry-on bag with unusual thoroughness, removing every item and subjecting each piece to detailed inspection. Her paperback novel was examined page by page, her toiletries were tested with electronic devices, and her clothing was carefully searched for hidden compartments. Sarah watched the process with growing irritation, though she maintained her outward composure. The examination was far more invasive than standard security procedures required, and she began to suspect that she had been targeted for reasons that had nothing to do with actual security concerns. Her years of experience with airport security protocols in dozens of countries told her that this was either harassment or incompetence. "What exactly are you looking for?" Sarah asked, her voice remaining level despite her growing frustration. "That's not your concern," Morrison replied with unmistakable hostility. "We have procedures to follow, and we'll follow them whether you like it or not." The dismissive tone and clear abuse of authority triggered something deep in Sarah's training and character. She had spent her career confronting bullies and tyrants in far more dangerous contexts, and she had no intention of being intimidated by a petty bureaucrat who was clearly exceeding his legitimate authority. "I understand you have procedures," Sarah said, her voice taking on a slight edge that anyone with military experience would recognize as a warning. "But I also have rights as a passenger, and I'd like to understand the legal basis for this level of examination." Morrison's face reddened at what he perceived as a challenge to his authority. "Lady, you can cooperate with our procedures, or you can explain to the police why you're refusing to comply with federal security requirements. Your choice." The threat was obvious and completely inappropriate, but Sarah recognized that she was dealing with someone who had become drunk on the small amount of power his position provided. She had encountered similar personalities throughout her military career, individuals who compensated for their own insecurities by abusing whatever authority they possessed. "I am cooperating," Sarah replied firmly. "I'm simply asking you to explain why you're conducting a search that appears to exceed standard TSA protocols. I've traveled extensively, and this level of examination is unusual without specific cause." The mention of her travel experience seemed to further irritate Morrison, who apparently interpreted it as another challenge to his expertise. "Oh, you think you know how airport security works? Well, let me tell you something, I've been doing this job for 15 years, and I don't need some smart-mouth passenger telling me how to do my job." Sarah felt her jaw tighten slightly, but she maintained her composure. She had faced down enemy combatants, negotiated with international terrorists, and commanded military operations involving hundreds of personnel. She was not going to be intimidated by an airport security supervisor having a power trip. "I'm not telling you how to do your job," Sarah said evenly. "I'm asking you to explain why you're doing it this way. That's a reasonable request from any passenger." Morrison stepped closer, invading her personal space in a clear attempt at intimidation. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to submit to whatever screening procedures I determine are necessary, or you're not getting on any airplane today. And, if you keep giving me attitude, we're going to have a much longer conversation. The threat was now explicit, and Sarah recognized that she was dealing with someone who had completely abandoned any pretense of professional conduct. Her military training included extensive instruction in de-escalation techniques, but it also included preparation for situations where de-escalation was impossible because the other party was determined to create a confrontation. I want to speak to your supervisor, Sarah said, her voice remaining calm but carrying an undertone of command authority that she couldn't entirely suppress. Morrison laughed unpleasantly. I am the supervisor, sweetheart. And, right now, you're going to do exactly what I tell you to do. The condescending endearment crossed a line that Sarah had encountered too many times during her military career. As one of the first women to complete SEAL training, she had faced discrimination, harassment, and attempts to undermine her authority throughout her rise through the ranks. She had learned to choose her battles carefully, but she had also learned never to allow disrespect to go unchallenged when the situation demanded action. My name is not sweetheart, Sarah said, her voice dropping to the low, controlled tone that her subordinates had learned to recognize as a warning. It's Ms. Mitchell, and I expect to be treated with the same respect you would show any other passenger. Morrison's eyes narrowed as he sensed that this passenger was different from the typical travelers who meekly accepted whatever treatment they received. Oh, you're one of those types, are you? Think you're special? Think the rules don't apply to you? Sarah could see that Morrison was escalating the confrontation deliberately, probably because he enjoyed exercising power over passengers who couldn't fight back without risking arrest or missing their flights. She began calculating her options, knowing that her military identity needed to remain secret but also recognizing that she might need to take action to protect her rights and dignity. I think the rules should apply equally to everyone, Sarah replied. Including TSA supervisors who abuse their authority. The direct challenge to his conduct caused Morrison to step back slightly, but his expression became even more hostile. That's it. You're coming with me for additional questioning. Johnson, call airport police and tell them we have an uncooperative passenger. The younger TSA officer looked uncomfortable with the escalation, clearly recognizing that the situation had moved far beyond normal security procedures. Sir, maybe we should just finish the bag search and, did I ask for your opinion? Morrison snapped. Do what I told you to do. Sarah realized that the situation was rapidly spinning out of control, driven by Morrison's ego and his apparent determination to assert dominance over a passenger who had dared to question his actions. Her military training had prepared her for complex tactical situations, but this civilian confrontation required a different set of skills. She could easily handle Morrison physically if necessary, her SEAL training had given her capabilities that he could never imagine. But any physical confrontation would destroy her cover identity and create exactly the kind of public incident she had gone to great lengths to avoid. She needed to find a way to defuse the situation while maintaining her anonymity and protecting her dignity. Officer Morrison, Sarah said, deliberately using his rank to establish a more formal tone, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm happy to cooperate with any legitimate security procedures. But, I need to understand what specific concerns have prompted this level of examination. Morrison apparently interpreted her attempt at de-escalation as weakness, because his demeanor became even more aggressive. Here's your specific concern, I don't like your attitude, and I don't like passengers who think they can tell me how to do my job. You're going to learn some respect before you leave this airport. The admission that his actions were motivated by personal animosity rather than security concerns was exactly what Sarah needed to hear. Morrison had just confessed to abusing his official position for personal reasons, which was both illegal and grounds for immediate disciplinary action. The question was whether she could use that admission effectively while maintaining her cover. I'd like that statement recorded, Sarah said calmly. You just admitted that you're conducting this search because you don't like my attitude, not because of any security concern. Morrison's face went white as he realized what he had just said in front of witnesses and potentially recording equipment. That's not. I didn't mean. You said exactly what you meant, Sarah replied, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she used when questioning enemy prisoners. And now we both know that this has nothing to do with airport security and everything to do with your personal issues. The confrontation was reaching a critical point where Morrison would either have to back down and admit his mistake, or escalate further to try to save face. Sarah's experience with similar personalities told her that he would choose escalation, which meant she needed to be prepared for whatever came next. Her carefully planned anonymous journey home was about to become something entirely different. Morrison's face flushed deep red as he realized his admission had been witnessed by multiple people, including his own subordinates and several passengers who had stopped to observe the increasingly heated confrontation. The airport security area, usually a space where his authority was absolute and unquestioned, suddenly felt like hostile territory where his words could be used against him. "You think you're real clever, don't you?" Morrison snarled, his professional facade completely abandoned now. "Well, let me show you just how thorough our security procedures can be. Johnson, escort this passenger to the private screening room. We're conducting a full-body search." The younger TSA officer looked genuinely distressed at the order. "Sir, I don't think that's necessary. Her bag search didn't reveal anything, and she's been cooperative. Did I ask what you think?" Morrison cut him off sharply. "We have reasonable suspicion that this passenger may be concealing prohibited items, and we're going to conduct whatever search is necessary to ensure flight safety." Sarah felt her blood pressure rise as she recognized the escalation for what it was, pure retaliation designed to humiliate her for challenging Morrison's authority. A strip search was the most invasive and degrading procedure TSA could legally conduct, and Morrison was clearly planning to use it as punishment rather than for any legitimate security purpose. "What reasonable suspicion?" Sarah demanded, her voice remaining controlled but taking on a harder edge. "You've searched my bag completely, I've passed through multiple metal detectors, and you found absolutely nothing suspicious. What specific evidence justifies a strip search?" Morrison smiled unpleasantly, apparently enjoying the power he wielded over someone who couldn't fight back without serious consequences. "Reasonable suspicion doesn't require specific evidence. It requires my professional judgment, and my judgment is that you need additional screening." Sarah knew that Morrison was stretching the legal interpretation of TSA authority far beyond its intended limits. Strip searches required specific justification based on concrete evidence of potential threats, not the personal whims of security supervisors. But she also knew that challenging the procedure legally would require revealing her identity and potentially creating a public incident that could compromise her cover. "I want to speak to the airport police," Sarah said firmly. "I want an independent witness to this procedure and an official record of your justification for ordering it." Morrison's expression faltered slightly as he realized that Sarah wasn't going to submit meekly to his abuse of power. Most passengers, faced with the threat of missing their flights or being arrested, would reluctantly comply with whatever demands he made. But this woman was calling his bluff and demanding accountability. "The police don't need to be involved," Morrison said, his tone becoming slightly less confident. "This is a routine TSA procedure conducted according to federal regulations. If it's routine and legitimate, then you shouldn't have any problem explaining it to police officers," Sarah replied, her military training and interrogation techniques helping her identify the weakness in his position. "Unless you're concerned that they might question your justification." The other TSA officers were now clearly uncomfortable with the situation. The experienced female officer, whose name tag identified her as Supervisor Williams, stepped forward and spoke quietly to Morrison. "Bob, maybe we should just finish the standard screening and move on. This is getting a lot of attention." Indeed, a small crowd of passengers had gathered to watch the confrontation, some recording with their phones. The airport's public areas were equipped with security cameras that would document every aspect of the incident, creating a permanent record that could be subpoenaed in any legal proceeding. Morrison glanced around at the watching crowd and seemed to realize that his actions were being observed and recorded by multiple witnesses. But, rather than backing down, he appeared to double down on his abusive behavior, perhaps calculating that he had gone too far to retreat without losing face. "I don't care who's watching," Morrison declared loudly. "Airport security is my responsibility, and I'm not going to let some smartmouth passenger tell me how to do my job. Williams, take her to room 3 and conduct the search." Full procedure. Supervisor Williams looked genuinely troubled by the order. Bob, I really think we should. Are you refusing to follow a direct order? Morrison interrupted, his voice rising. Because if you are, we can have a conversation with management about your continued employment. Sarah watched the exchange with growing anger, recognizing the classic pattern of an abusive supervisor using threats against subordinates to cover his own misconduct. Williams was clearly uncomfortable with the situation but felt trapped between her professional obligations and her recognition that the order was inappropriate. I'll file a formal complaint about this entire procedure, Sarah said, directing her words to Williams rather than Morrison. And I'll request a copy of all security camera footage documenting this incident. Morrison laughed harshly. File all the complaints you want. By the time anyone investigates, you'll be just another passenger who couldn't follow simple instructions. Your word against mine. Sarah felt a cold smile cross her face, the same expression that had made enemy combatants very nervous during interrogations in hostile territories. Morrison had just revealed that he was counting on the difficulty passengers typically faced when challenging TSA procedures, assuming that his official position would protect him from accountability. Actually, it will be my word, supported by video evidence, witness testimony, and your own admission that this search is motivated by personal animus rather than security concerns, Sarah said calmly. I think investigators will find that very interesting. For the first time, Morrison looked genuinely worried as he realized that this passenger was far more sophisticated and prepared than he had anticipated. Most travelers subjected to TSA abuse either submitted quietly or exploded in anger that discredited their complaints. But Sarah was methodically documenting his misconduct while maintaining complete composure. Look, lady, you can make this easy or you can make it hard, Morrison said, his tone becoming more desperate. But either way, you're not boarding any aircraft until you submit to our security procedures. Sarah recognized that Morrison was now trapped by his own escalation. He had publicly committed to conducting the strip search, and backing down would be an admission that his actions had been inappropriate from the beginning. But proceeding would expose him to serious legal and professional consequences, especially with the level of documentation that was accumulating. Then, I guess I'm not boarding any aircraft, Sarah said quietly. Because I'm not submitting to an illegal search conducted for improper purposes by someone who has already admitted his motivations have nothing to do with security. The statement hung in the air like a challenge that neither Morrison nor anyone else had expected. Passengers simply didn't refuse TSA searches, regardless of how inappropriate they might be. The power dynamic was too unequal, and the consequences of resistance were too severe. But Morrison was discovering that he was dealing with someone who operated by a completely different set of rules, someone who had faced down far more dangerous adversaries in far more hostile environments. Someone who would not be intimidated by petty bureaucrats abusing their limited authority. You're refusing to comply with federal security requirements, Morrison said, his voice now shaking slightly with either anger or nervousness. That's a federal crime. I'm refusing to comply with an illegal search that exceeds your authority and violates my constitutional rights, Sarah corrected. There's a significant difference, and any competent attorney will explain it to you. Williams stepped forward again, clearly hoping to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled completely out of control. Ma'am, maybe we can find a compromise here. If you could just, there is no compromise with illegal conduct, Sarah interrupted, her voice taking on the tone of absolute command that had been honed through decades of military leadership. Either this search is legally justified or it isn't. Either Mr. Morrison is acting within his authority or he's abusing his position. And his own words have already answered both questions. Morrison was now visibly sweating as he realized that his attempt to intimidate a passenger had instead created a situation where his own conduct was under scrutiny. The watching crowd had grown larger, and several people were clearly recording the entire exchange. Fine, Morrison said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. If you want to do this the hard way, we'll do it the hard way. Johnson, call airport police and tell them we have a passenger refusing to comply with security screening. Tell them we need her arrested. Sarah felt a familiar sense of calm settle over her as the situation moved from confrontation to crisis. Her SEAL training had prepared her for far worse scenarios than being arrested by local police, and she was confident that any legal proceeding would ultimately vindicate her position. More importantly, she was determined not to let Morrison's abuse of power go unchallenged. "Please do call the police," Sarah said evenly. "I want them to hear Mr. Morrison explain his justification for ordering a strip search based solely on his dislike of my attitude. I want them to review the video evidence of this entire encounter. And I want them to explain to him the legal requirements for conducting invasive searches of airline passengers." Morrison's face went pale as he realized that Sarah was actually welcoming police involvement, the one thing that most passengers would desperately want to avoid. Her confidence suggested that she knew something he didn't, or that she had resources he hadn't considered. As Johnson reluctantly reached for his radio to call for police backup, Morrison made one final attempt to reassert control over the situation. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into," he warned. "You think you're so smart, but you're about to learn what happens when you challenge federal authority." Sarah looked at him with the cold, measuring gaze she had once used to evaluate enemy commanders before decisive engagements. "Mr. Morrison, I've challenged real authority in places you can't imagine. You're not federal authority, you're a petty bureaucrat who's about to learn the difference between legitimate power and the abuse of position." The words were spoken quietly, but something in Sarah's tone made Morrison step back involuntarily. For just a moment, he glimpsed something in her eyes that suggested he was dealing with someone far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. Someone who had faced real enemies in real combat and was completely unimpressed by his playground bullying tactics. The airport police were on their way, and Morrison was beginning to realize that he might have made the biggest mistake of his career. But it was too late to back down now. The confrontation had reached the point where someone was going to face serious consequences, and Sarah Mitchell, Admiral and Navy SEAL, was perfectly prepared to see it through to the end. The airport police officers arrived within minutes, their presence immediately changing the dynamics of the confrontation. Officer Maria Santos, a veteran of the department with 15 years of experience, and her younger partner, Officer David Chen, approached the scene with the practiced caution of professionals who understood that airport incidents could escalate quickly and unpredictably. Officer Santos surveyed the situation, taking note of the agitated TSA supervisor, the calm passenger who had supposedly caused the disturbance, and the crowd of witnesses with their smartphones recording every moment. Her experience told her that this wasn't a typical case of an unruly passenger refusing security screening. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Santos asked, addressing Morrison directly while keeping Sarah in her peripheral vision. Morrison immediately launched into his version of events, his voice carrying the indignation of someone who believed his authority had been unjustifiably challenged. "This passenger is refusing to comply with mandatory security screening. I ordered a strip search based on reasonable suspicion, and she's refusing to submit to the procedure. I need her arrested for violating federal aviation security regulations." Officer Santos turned to Sarah, noting her calm demeanor and professional bearing. "Ma'am, is that your understanding of what happened here?" Sarah's response was measured and precise, delivered with the clarity of someone accustomed to briefing senior officials under pressure. "Officer, I've complied with all legitimate security procedures. I've been through multiple security checkpoints, submitted to bag searches and metal detector screening, and cooperated fully with all reasonable requests. What I've refused to submit to is an invasive search that Mr. Morrison himself admitted was ordered because he doesn't like my attitude, not because of any security concerns." Officer Santos looked between the two parties, her experienced eye immediately recognizing which version was more credible. "Mr. Morrison, did you make such a statement?" Morrison's face flushed as he realized his earlier admission was now being scrutinized by law enforcement. That's not, she's taking my words out of context. I was explaining that uncooperative passengers require additional screening. The security cameras will show exactly what was said," Sarah interjected calmly. "As will the witnesses who heard Mr. Morrison explicitly state that his search order was based on his personal dislike of my attitude rather than any security concern." Officer Chen had been quietly observing the crowd of witnesses, several of whom nodded in agreement with Sarah's account. He stepped closer to his partner and spoke quietly. "The witnesses I've talked to confirm her version. They say the TSA supervisor escalated the situation after she asked reasonable questions about the search procedures. Officer Santos felt her instincts about the situation confirmed. In her experience, passengers who were actually trying to circumvent security were either belligerent and defensive or nervous and evasive. This woman displayed neither characteristic. Instead, she showed the controlled confidence of someone who was completely comfortable with scrutiny and accountability. Mr. Morrison, I need you to explain the specific security concern that justified ordering a strip search, Officer Santos said formally. What evidence or behavior prompted that level of screening? Morrison found himself trapped by his own earlier admissions and the presence of multiple witnesses. She was argumentative and showed signs of suspicious behavior. What suspicious behavior? Officer Santos pressed. Did she attempt to bring prohibited items through security? Did she display nervous or evasive responses to questioning? Did she make any threatening statements? She questioned my authority, Morrison replied, his voice becoming defensive. She acted like she knew better than I did how to conduct security procedures. Officer Santos exchanged a glance with her partner, both recognizing that Morrison had just confirmed Sarah's account of the incident. Questioning authority wasn't grounds for a strip search, and Morrison's justification revealed that his actions were motivated by ego rather than security concerns. Ma'am, may I see your identification and boarding documents? Officer Santos asked Sarah. Sarah handed over her driver's license and boarding pass, both of which identified her as Sarah J. Mitchell, marketing consultant. Officer Santos examined the documents carefully, noting that everything appeared to be in perfect order. Ms. Mitchell, have you ever been arrested or charged with any aviation-related offenses? Officer Santos asked, following standard protocol. No, I have not, Sarah replied. I have an extensive travel history and have never had any security issues at any airport. Officer Santos was beginning to form a clear picture of what had actually happened. An experienced traveler had asked reasonable questions about invasive security procedures, triggering the ego of a TSA supervisor who had then escalated the situation far beyond appropriate bounds. It was a scenario she had encountered before, and it rarely ended well for the overzealous security personnel. Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need you to provide me with the specific TSA regulation that authorizes strip searches based on passengers questioning your procedures, Officer Santos said. Because from where I stand, this looks like an abuse of authority. Morrison's face went white as he realized that the police officers were not automatically supporting his version of events. I don't need to justify my security procedures to local police. This is a federal matter under TSA jurisdiction. Actually, when you request our assistance in arresting someone, it becomes our matter, Officer Santos replied firmly. And we're not going to arrest anyone without probable cause and proper justification. The crowd of witnesses had continued to grow, and Sarah noticed several airline employees and airport management personnel who had arrived to observe the situation. Word was clearly spreading that something significant was happening at the security checkpoint. Officer Santos, Sarah said quietly, I'd like to file a formal complaint about Mr. Morrison's conduct. He admitted that his search order was based on personal animus rather than security concerns, and I believe he's violated both TSA policies and federal law governing airport security procedures. Morrison's desperation was now obvious as he realized that his attempt to intimidate a passenger had backfired spectacularly. You can't trust anything she says. For all we know, she could be anyone. She could be a terrorist trying to test our security procedures. The accusation was so absurd and obviously born of panic that Officer Santos couldn't hide her incredulous expression. Mr. Morrison, are you seriously suggesting that this woman is a terrorist because she asked questions about your search procedures? I'm saying we don't really know who she is, Morrison replied, grasping at straws. She could be using false identification. She could be working with hostile organizations to probe our security weaknesses. Sarah felt her patience finally reach its limit. Morrison's accusations had crossed the line from professional misconduct into territory that directly challenged her patriotism and dedication to national security. The irony that a TSA supervisor was questioning the loyalty of a decorated admiral who had spent her career fighting actual terrorists was almost overwhelming. "Officer Santos," Sarah said, her voice taking on a new tone of authority, "I think it's time to clarify exactly who I am and why, Mr. Morrison's accusations are not just inappropriate but absurd." Sarah reached into her wallet and withdrew a card that she had hoped never to need during this trip. It was her military identification, clearly identifying her as Admiral Sarah J. Mitchell, United States Navy, with the highest level of security clearance indicated by the card's special coding. Officer Santos examined the military ID carefully, her expression changing as she absorbed the implications of what she was seeing. She looked up at Sarah with new understanding and considerable respect. "Admiral Mitchell," Officer Santos said formally, "I apologize for any inconvenience this situation has caused." Morrison's face went from white to green as he realized the magnitude of his mistake. He had just accused a decorated admiral in the United States Navy of being a terrorist, ordered an invasive search based on personal animosity, and abused his authority in front of multiple witnesses including law enforcement officers. "Admiral?" Morrison whispered, his voice barely audible. "Rear Admiral Sarah Mitchell, United States Navy," Sarah confirmed, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of command authority. "I've spent the last 30 years of my life serving this country, including 18 months in classified counter-terrorism operations that you'll never hear about in the news. I've dedicated my entire adult life to protecting American citizens from the very threats you just accused me of representing." The silence that followed was profound. Even the crowd of witnesses seemed to sense that something significant had just been revealed, though most of them couldn't fully understand the implications. Morrison looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him. He had just subjected a high-ranking military officer to harassment and threatened her with illegal search procedures, all while accusing her of disloyalty to the country she had served with distinction. "Ma'am. Admiral. I didn't know." Morrison stammered. "The problem, Mr. Morrison, is that my rank is irrelevant," Sarah said, her voice cutting through his attempts at apology. "You would have been wrong to treat any passenger the way you treated me today. You abused your authority, violated TSA policies, and conducted yourself in a manner that brings discredit to federal law enforcement." Officer Santos stepped forward, recognizing that the situation had evolved far beyond a simple airport disturbance. "Admiral Mitchell, what would you like us to do about this situation?" Sarah considered her options carefully. Her first instinct was to ensure that Morrison faced appropriate consequences for his misconduct, but she also needed to consider the broader implications of the incident. Too much publicity could compromise her cover identity and interfere with future operations. "I want a full investigation of Mr. Morrison's conduct," Sarah said finally. "I want all video evidence preserved, and I want him removed from any position where he can abuse passengers who don't have the resources to defend themselves." Morrison seemed to shrink under the weight of Sarah's gaze and the realization that his career was effectively over. "Admiral, please, I made a mistake. I was just doing my job." "No, Mr. Morrison," Sarah interrupted. "You were abusing your position to satisfy your ego. There's a significant difference, and that difference is why you're not qualified to wear any uniform that represents the United States government." Airport management personnel had now arrived, including the terminal director, who immediately recognized both the seriousness of the situation and the need for damage control. Sarah found herself surrounded by apologetic officials offering explanations, apologies, and assurances that the incident would be thoroughly investigated. But Sarah's attention was focused on the other TSA officers, particularly Williams, who had clearly been uncomfortable with Morrison's conduct but felt powerless to intervene effectively. "Supervisor Williams," Sarah said, addressing her directly, "you knew that Mr. Morrison's actions were inappropriate. In the future, I hope you'll find the courage to speak up when you witness misconduct, regardless of the personal cost." Williams nodded, understanding that she had received both criticism and guidance from someone whose opinion carried considerable weight. "Yes, ma'am. I will." As the immediate crisis subsided and officials began discussing next steps, Sarah reflected on the lessons of the encounter. She had maintained her composure under pressure, documented misconduct systematically, and ultimately prevailed without compromising her mission or resorting to physical confrontation. It was exactly the kind of measured response that her military training had prepared her for, even in civilian contexts. The incident would have consequences that extended far beyond Morrison's career. It would serve as a reminder that authority without accountability becomes tyranny, and that sometimes ordinary citizens, or in this case, extraordinary citizens in ordinary clothes, must be willing to challenge those who abuse their power. Sarah Mitchell, Admiral and Navy SEAL, had successfully completed another mission, even though this one had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with basic human dignity and the principle that in America, no one is above the law.